Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, if there is anything good about the city's bumpy streets, it is that they might reduce speeding. Unfortunately, some streets are so dark at night that drivers cannot see the bumps anyway. On a weekend of giving thanks, we're hoping the streets might be better by next year. All the better for driving to what is an emerging new pastime, sports betting. We'll be looking at these stories tonight, as well as wetlands damage due to Hurricane Ida and what to expect at Carnival. We'll also discuss sports and injuries and, in honor of the season, positive developments on the environmental front. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Jeff Duncan, sports reporter of the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and analyst for WVUE-Fox 8 Sports, Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter, and Mark Schlafstein, environmental reporter for the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. We're going to go to Mark first. Ida is something really not a good memory, definitely not a good memory for all of us here. It was a storm that we certainly don't want to have to ever repeat, but what did it do to our wetlands?
Well, yeah, lost in the reporting on the damage of homes, businesses, infrastructure by Ida was the environmental damage caused by the storm. The hurricane's eye crossed over Port Fourchon, Cheniere Caminada on the coast, and then went up Bayou Lafourche, right to the east of the bayou. And that put its storm surge to that eastern portion of it, just tearing up the wetlands in Barataria Bay as it moved north towards the New Orleans area. And a preliminary study by the U.S. Geological Survey has estimated now that 106 square miles of wetlands were turned into open water, much of it south of Lake Salvador, east of Delta Farms and Clovelly Farms, if you can figure out where that is, and west of Little Lake, right there on the western side of the Barataria Bay. And it's clear where some of the wetlands in the area actually ended up. You heard complaints in Jean Lafitte when people were finally able to get back to their flooded homes, flooded by the 11 feet of storm surge with waves half as high on top of that, that their streets and yards were covered with mud and grass, filled the ditches. And that was that wetlands that we're talking about that got washed away. You also saw wetland grasses on the levees along the West Bank as well. That's something else that we're still cleaning up today. A big chunk of those lost wetlands were what's called flotant, and that's a marsh mat, a mat of grasses that grows on top of the water, and it's connected by roots that go through the water to the bottom of Barataria Bay. And those big mats got washed away. And the question is whether or not they'll be able to be replaced naturally. Will they slowly grow back? There's not really a good indicator that can happen very quickly. If it does happen, it could take a couple of years, and it will require the bottoms that they were rooted into staying as high as they were before the storm, which is another problem. Another portion of the wetlands, though, were actually plant life that lives on top of the water that is not rooted to the bottom. And that material is much more likely to come back if it can find places to grow in areas that where wetlands are coming back. And then the biggest question is whether or not the actual wetlands that were rooted to the earth in the areas south of the Lake Salvador, whether or not they can actually grow back. And it's going to take a couple of years to figure that out. We're going to need several growing seasons, spring growing seasons, to see what's coming back. One of the issues that caused a problem in terms of trying to figure out how much wetlands were lost was that it takes water from a hurricane quite a few days to evacuate the area where it looked like wetlands were lost. And it was really only until that water got back out into the Gulf of Mexico that you could actually see what wetlands were still there. So we're still going to see what's going to go on. But the U.S. Geological Survey expects to have a report, a much broader report of the entire coastline of Louisiana and where it stands 4 or 5 years from their last report in terms of wetlands loss at the beginning of next year.
Okay, so Barrier Islands, how did they stand the storm? How did they hold up?
Well, again, if you consider Port Fourchon and the Cheniere Caminada, it's not really a barrier island, but it's what they call a barrier headland. It's basically wetlands fronted by beach. They got torn up significantly, but a lot of that material ended up being, a lot of the sand that was on the southern shore ended up being blown into areas where the state was actually building new wetlands to the north. So that sand will end up being replaced in the future. And the sand that moved inland will be used as part of that wetlands, new wetland area. On Grand Isle, the bigger problem is going to be replacing the sand dunes that acted as a levee, and that's going to take a while for the state and the Corps of Engineers to determine how best to do that.
Okay, all right, Mark, thanks a lot, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about this later on in the show. Right now, though, going over to Jeff, and sports betting is here.
Yeah, Marcia, it'd be hard to not notice it with all the advertising around town, signage all over billboards in the city, and also on TV, radio. This is big business for the state of Louisiana. A lot of global, national companies have seen Louisiana as a wide open playing field, and we're just waiting for our state to get online. We are now online. Of course, voters a year ago voted for 55 of the 64 parishes to have sports betting. It's taken it a while to get online. Hurricane Ida delayed a lot of that. Regulation was going on by the state police. They have to regulate these casinos, but it's finally up and running. I think started last month in Marksville at the casino there, and in New Orleans, of course, on Halloween Day, finally took the first bet in a casino down at Caesars in downtown. And we already have, I think, 7 more casinos across the state that have come online. 7 more are pending, and I think 5 more after that. There'll be about 20. Eventually, you will be able to get bets not only in a brick and mortar building like Harrah's in downtown New Orleans or at the racetrack out at Fairgrounds, but you'll also be able to bet in kiosks. Wherever you have video poker licenses, you're going to probably see a sports betting kiosk in there as well. And then the big really boon for these sports books is mobile betting. That has not gotten up online yet in the state. Eventually is going to happen, I'm hearing, around January 1st. So when they hope that will go online, and that will allow you to make a bet on your smartphone. You could be sitting in a Saints game in the Superdome and make a bet on the game during the live sporting event. And that is where most of the big business is. And that's why we're seeing these big companies come into New Orleans and in Louisiana right now jockeying for that market share, trying to get as many people online as possible for their sports betting apps, getting positioned for when that happens in January. And I can't tell you how big this is going to be. I've talked to some sports betting industry experts, and they don't know, because Louisiana is always been viewed as potentially the biggest sports betting state in the South. Because New Orleans is a destination location, much like Las Vegas, they think it could be something like Las Vegas of the southern region for sports betting, that people would come here, of course, go and take advantage of all the great nightlife, and then still be able to bet on sports. Right. So we'll see where that goes.
Well, just, for our local population, those of us who live here, I know people who bet on sports games. They've been doing it for a very long time. It's a real science for them.
Well, and it's always been illegal, right? It's been
right.
An underground activity, or you had to drive over the last handful of years over to Mississippi across the border and make bets over at the casinos over there on the Gulf Coast. No longer going to have to do that. And eventually this is going to expand, I think, to where we see brick and mortar sports betting halls, if you will, around the Superdome, around the Smoothie King Center, much like you see over in Europe. where you can just go make a bet off the street, or like I said, in any of the bars and restaurants that have video poker right now. That's going to happen as well. This was in the first 9 months, just to give you an example of how big a business this is, $2.6 billion in the United States bet on sports in the first 9 months. That's huge business, up 300% over a year ago. So this is going on all over the country, not just here in Louisiana. We were a little bit slow to get online, but most experts think it's going to be huge in our state.
But Jeff, remember the days when the major league sports would not even go into a community if they had a casino with sports betting? And now in Louisiana, you say we have 7 casinos with sports betting. So there's been a real change in attitude about that.
I think no better example of that is the naming rights of the Superdome. The fact that Caesars is now on the Superdome, it's ubiquitous in that building now if you go in there. The lines have blurred, there's no question about it. Just a decade ago, the NFL wanted nothing to do with sports betting. They wouldn't even endorse fantasy football sites. And now, of course, they're in bed with sports betting, as every pro sports franchise league is at this point. I know right now in Washington, D.C., Errol, you can go in to the Washington Capitals, the hockey arena, and the basketball arena for the Wizards, and they have a sports book in the arena, and you can make bets there while you're watching the game. That's the way it's been going on in Europe for decades, actually centuries probably. So we're slowly embracing it, and I think the reason we're embracing it is because it's big business like everything else.
Jeff, is there a sport that benefits from having sports betting? Is there a sport that, like, little known, that betting will help?
Oh, I think that's a good question, Don. I think it's going to help every sport. I mean, you can bet on everything these days. It's mind-boggling how widespread betting is. If you get one of these apps, and you can get and download these sports apps right now and play around with them until the betting goes online, and you can bet on highlight and cricket and international sporting events, and it's not just on who wins and loses and the score. You can bet on individual players and what they might do. It's really unlimited, and it's going to take a lot of education for the public, and I know that the local casinos are already ramping up kind of educational seminars and forums to try and educate people.
Okay, real quickie, because we have to wrap this up.
Well, I was going to say, during the week, Sean Payton made the Saints had another bad call last week, and Sean Payton was saying, now that we have sports betting, we're going to have to be better about officiating, because that's going to affect a lot of people's bets and the amount of integrity they think the sports have.
Yeah, and that's why we've always had an injury report for that exact reason, to try and educate and be as transparent as possible. But there's always going to be cloak and dagger involved with that. But I do think that's a really good point. And it's just around the corner one day, just mark my words, there will be a big scandal in America with some kind of sports betting underground business. It's going to happen.
Okay, we'll see where it all goes. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Don, over to you. City streets of New Orleans. Sometimes it can be a bit challenging.
They can be a lot challenging. And for those of you who are on Instagram, there is a very now popular Instagram site called, pardon my French, look at this, effing street. This was started almost tongue-in-cheek by a guy who said, and he wants to remain anonymous. I spoke to him by phone this week. He said, you know, I just would drive through the city for my job and be like, oh, look at this blank street, and take pictures, and started posting them. Well, his Instagram group has now grown to over 50,000 followers, including the city of New Orleans and members of the Sewage and Water Board and Public Works Department. And it seems like his tongue-in-cheek just, hey, look how bad it is actually starting to make a difference in a public service kind of way for the community. He posted, he said not long ago, a picture where literally a project had literally blocked access to a city bar, the OK Bar, that was open for business or wanted to be open for business, but based on the work that was done, nobody could actually get to their front door because there was no more sidewalk. It was posted, and that day somebody showed up to start making repairs. So it's unfortunate in modern society that we need to turn to things like that, but it seems to be working, where projects get posted and all of a sudden there's a conversation that goes back and forth and work gets finished. He did say, however, he doesn't like to put up funny pictures when there is work actually underway. He doesn't want to punish people for doing their jobs, and jobs are being done. I know we've talked, I think I lost count at 5 times about the road construction work that's supposed to start at Magazine Street between Leek Avenue and East Drive, kind of in front of Audubon Zoo. They actually say they will be marking the street for marking and staging for the repair job on December the 10th, and all of the work will start after the Christmas holidays. We'll talk about it here if it actually happens. But look at this effing street has shown is that we used to complain a lot about Lakeview, and Lakeview streets are so bad, and Lakeview was the worst in the city. The city seems to be spreading the wealth lately. Errol, I know, complained to me recently about St. Charles Avenue and Uptown streets, Magazine Street, where that project is happening. Uptown is bad, Gentilly is bad, the 7th Ward is bad. So the wealth is everywhere, but the work is actually happening everywhere. In Uptown, where it's gotten worse and worse, there are $22 million worth of projects underway or starting. Some were delayed by Hurricane Ida, but they're happening. Audubon Group A, there's a water line that's going to be tied in on December 4th, but that project that's been on Calhoun Street by Holy Name and Loyola University that's caused a lot of traffic jams is getting ready to wrap up. An Octavia Street project from Ferret to Claiborne was delayed by Hurricane Ida, but that just kicked off within the last couple of weeks. Audubon Group B, which is a $15 million project, is getting ready to kick off after the first of the year. So the work is coming, but keep, post it, and you might actually see some progress. It's not only about potholes anymore. It's about just non-existent roadways, which you were talking about right outside of the Sewage and Water Board.
Right. Yeah, there's a real problem right there, right alongside, and it's been there for a long time. And it's getting worse as the street is just collapsing. Okay, Don, thanks a lot. E, over to you. What's Carnival looking like?
Well, there's some good indications. I mean, by all indications, there will be parades, and there's going to be some restrictions. We don't know all those restrictions yet, but there will be some. As far certainly, riders going to have to show their vaccination cards, and we don't know about rules about distancing in terms of people watching the parades. The big thing is the parade route. The mayor's office indicated that maybe they're going to need to standardize and all the parades in one route. Let me tell you, if that happens, it's going to be a disaster. They've tried it before. It would all be along the uptown route. It's hard on the people uptown. If they're worried right now about the streets, I mean, when you got parade after parade after parade, and then there are some parades like Endymion and Totes and Zulu that are so much a part of an established neighborhood, that's going to cause a big problem. So that's going to have to be worked out. And the problem is work shortage, just labor shortage. And it's going to be an ongoing problem. And who knows, maybe it needs to be some sort of independent fund that has to kick in for the for the police power. And so that's part of the issues. A good thing, one of the big successes for not having the parades last year was the whole neighborhood block decorations thing. People love that. And what it did, including me, because what it did is it brought the celebration back into the neighborhoods. It allowed a lot of creativity. And that's supposed to come back. The organizers are saying that they can bring it back. And so if we get to the point where every year we don't need more parades, but we do need more blocks decorated, and there's almost an infinite supply. So if that happens, I think that could just add a whole new life to Carnival. And so I think it's good that that's happening. Kind of a touching story. There was a guy named Will Samuels. He had this big idea over the last few years. He loved king cakes. And he wanted to say, well, look, instead of getting one king cake here, one there are so many competing king cake makers now that he started a thing a couple of years ago called the King Cake Hub. Last year it was at the Broad Theater on Broad Street, where all the king cake makers could go and you can pick and choose. Unfortunately, Will Samuels died during the past year, but his widow has taken over the business. And she's running, she's got contacts with the same people that was supplying them, including Brennan's that'll be having them. And they're going to be at this place on Broad Street called the Zony Mash, which is a beer hub and party kind of place. And so that's going to be a main place, and also at the Historic New Orleans Collection. And so the King Cake Hub will be back, and the decorations in the blocks will be back.
Okay, we look forward to Carnival season 2022. Thanks a lot, E. Mark, let's go back on over to you and talk about some positive things for, our environmental issues, particularly for the Louisiana coast.
So yeah, let's talk about wetlands again. And there is positive news despite the bad news from Hurricane Ida, and it's it was given at the same meeting of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority as the update on the Ida losses, and that is that the state officials announced that, not including those losses, recent coastal restoration projects, both completed and still under construction, about almost $6 billion worth, will create almost 14,000 acres of coastal wetlands, the equivalent of 22 square miles. And because the state expects to be spending about $1 billion a year on restoration and levees over the next 5 to 10 years at least, and hopes to continue doing it indefinitely throughout the next 50 years, they hope that what they've now reached is this level where the restoration efforts are equaling the amount of loss each year. And that is good news if we can actually reach that level. The problem is going to be with climate change and sea level rise. And the climate change and sea level rise in part is being caused by emissions from Louisiana. We are the third or fourth largest producer of carbon emissions in the state, and our emissions are as large as many countries around the world, and so it's pretty significant. Well, the state's doing something about that as well. It has a task force that is putting together a variety of different proposals for reducing emissions and or capturing them and disposing of them deep underground, that it expects that plan to be in place for having the legislature and the Public Service Commission act on it early next year. And so we'll see what happens, but that's, again, good news, especially, you know, this is a week after COP26, the big meeting, UN meeting of everybody talking about how significant it is that states and nations need to do something about reducing their emissions to keep sea level rise and other climate issues in tow.
Well, we're keeping up with it, you know, in terms of the coastal loss. I mean, does it seem like we'll ever get ahead?
No, we're not going to get ahead, and that's something that we really do need to recognize. There will continue to be significant losses of the remaining wetlands along our coast, except in the areas that we are focusing on with these projects that are largely going to be in front of the levee systems that are aimed at protecting the populated areas. And that's just reality. Sea level rise is going to continue to overtake our wetlands throughout the end of this century and into the next century, just because of the emissions that are already in place in the air.
Okay, Mark, thanks a lot. Always very informative and also kind of concerning, too. Thanks.
Yes.
All righty, Jeff, let's go on over to you now to wrap us up. And our sports seasons have been kind of rough.
That'd be a good way to put it, Marcia. I mean, Willie Green, the first-year coach of the Pelicans, I can't imagine he envisioned this happening in his first year as a head coach in the NBA. Pelicans off to the second worst record in the NBA, and it's just kind of bleak right now on and off the court. Zion Williamson, their star player, hasn't played yet. He had off-season surgery on his foot, and that has obviously put them behind the eight ball. He's easily the best player on the team, the biggest draw for the team, so attendance is way down, TV ratings way down, just not a lot of good going on for the Pelicans. And there's a lot of pressure right now on general manager David Griffin to get things turned around. This is his third season, and it is not playing out the way he expected.
It's also been heartbreaking in the football end for us, too, and seeing so many players hurt and out, unable to play. We've seen it with the Saints. I mean, are we seeing this sort of across the NFL now? Just so many injuries.
Well, I do think injuries are up. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Certainly with the Saints, it's more than I've ever seen. I can tell you that. I've covered the team 21 years. I've never seen a team as decimated as the Saints are right now, especially on the offensive side of the ball. But I think it's a combination of things. One, I think the players are bigger, stronger, and faster. It's just sheer physics when you have a collision sport like that you're going to have more injuries. And I also think there's a heightened awareness. It's much more advanced sports medicine in these organizations to recognize the concerns and the risks of playing with even a slight injury, and players now are obviously looking out for themselves, and that's probably a good thing for everyone involved. But it's been a tough start for the Saints in their first year without Drew Brees. They needed a lot of things to go right. Their margin for error is a lot smaller now, and without as many key players as they've had to play with, it's just too much to overcome.
Hey, Jeff, are teams that play on artificial turf, are they more susceptible to injuries?
Yes, studies show. Sean Payton can recite that number for you exactly. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but he mentioned earlier, we all remember Jameis Winston twisting his knee and tearing his ligaments in his knee. Sean Payton said he does not believe that injury would have happened on natural turf. So that's part of the risk as well. And more stadiums are going to this because it's much cheaper to maintain an artificial turf field, especially these indoor venues like we have today.
Yep, rough season so far. Okay, let's wrap everything up now with other stories. And Errol, we're going to go over to you.
A publication called Cruise Industry News reported today that New Orleans expects 285 cruise ship calls this coming year, actually beginning this weekend with a Norwegian ship arriving. And so that's ships that are coming, most of them going into the Gulf Coast. But the other thing is that we're having an increase in the river boats, especially with Viking cruises coming in, which is a major player. Viking is all over Europe with their river cruises, and so the cruise industry is going to even be that much more enhanced.
Okay, Don, over to you.
Well, signs of life, not just at the port downtown, but kind of all over with Bayou Classic back this weekend, and then the real kickoff. The lights were lit this week, but Christmas Fest is coming back to the convention center, movies back on the Mississippi, so signs of life returning around the holidays.
Good signs. Mark.
Yeah, we're going to have a series that's going to run through the weekend about wind and wind power and the role that wind farms off of our coast will play in helping to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that the state is producing and producing alternative electricity for us to use in our new electric cars when all of those begin arriving.
All right, we'll be looking for that. Jeff, over to you.
One of the great New Orleans sporting traditions started again this weekend with the beginning of the New Orleans Fairgrounds race meet on Thursday, Thanksgiving Day, traditional start. We'll have 4 more months now of horse racing, and you can finally get back out to the track in person. Fans welcome, and that's always a good sign.
All righty, guys. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for joining us, too, and we will see you again next week for Informed Sources. Enjoy your Thanksgiving weekend. Have a good evening.